So I guess I'll introduce you, and please let me know if I get anything wrong. But on today's show, I have Dr. Gregory Gause. I'm
Oh,
pronouncing that right, correct?
yeah, gauze, like the bandage.
Gause. All right. He is the Department of International. He is the head of Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. His research focuses on the international politics of the Middle East, with a particular interest in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. Howdy, Dr. Gause. How are you doing?
Howdy. That's a good Texas A&M greeting. That's
Yeah,
our official greeting at A&M.
I saw that you used that greeting in your lecture, so I had to use it on you.
There we go.
I'm over in New York, so we typically just say, "How's it going?" And that means hello.
Right.
But thank you so much for joining me today. With Saudi Arabia in the news, and my audience knows that we cover Saudi Arabia a lot, I really thought it would be valuable to have somebody with a lot more experience in the field than I have. I wanted to specifically talk about MBS, what's going on right now in the Middle East between the Cold War, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and try to just make some sense of it all with your insight. And I think a good place to start would be to talk about MBS, how this young guy essentially became the head of state at such a young age. So if you could please give some insight on that.
Sure. Well, it's a monarchy. So you don't have to fight your way up if you're the son of the king. But and he is. But it is an interesting case because in Saudi Arabia, for decades now, we haven't had the kingship pass from father to son. It's passed along a line of brothers and half-brothers, all of whom were sons of the original founding king of modern Saudi Arabia, a guy in the West we call Ibn Saud. And the current king, King Salman, is one of those sons. And so since the 1950s, the succession in Saudi Arabia has gone horizontally, not vertically. So this is really the first opportunity for the next generation, represented by the grandsons of Ibn Saud, and Mohammed bin Salman is one of the youngest of those grandsons, to get into the kingship. And so I think a lot of observers of Saudi Arabia, myself included, thought that when the transfer came to the next generation, it would be some of the older grandsons. And there are grandsons of Abdulaziz who are in their 70s and 80s now. And I kind of thought that they were going to recreate the system along the lines that their fathers had, which is kind of a rule by committee. King is first among equals, and succession would pass not from father to son, but along from, in this case, in this generation, cousin to cousin. But King Salman overturned that. When he came into power, he originally named one of his half-brothers as his crown prince, and then within months kicked him out. Then identified one of the older grandsons of Ibn Saud, a guy named Mohammed Bin Nayef, who was Minister of the Interior. Minister of the Interior there is not like it is in the United States. It's basically the police guy, the internal security people. And Mohammed Bin Nayef was he was close to the United States. He cooperated with America after 9/11. He was the main point of contact on counterterrorism and intelligence sharing with Saudi Arabia. So people in Washington always liked Mohammed Bin Nayef. They thought he'd be a good king. And people in the Obama administration thought that it would be a smooth transition from King Salman to Mohammed Bin Nayef, with Mohammed Bin Salman kind of coming up, and maybe he'd be crown prince when Mohammed Bin Nayef was king. But then, after President Trump got in, there was a very close relationship established between the Trump White House and Mohammed Bin Salman. Jared Kushner and Mohammed Bin Salman were in direct contact. It was an unusual kind of back channel communication. And the Trump administration seemed to be very supportive of MBS, and they were willing to support him in an effort to get rid of, Mohammed Bin Nayef out of the line of succession. I don't think that would have happened in any other American administration. This was a more direct American involvement in Saudi succession questions than we've seen in the past. So, with the support of the Trump administration, Mohammed bin Salman convinced his father to turf out Mohammed bin Nayef, and in mid 2017, Mohammed bin Salman becomes the crown prince. And so I think that's an interesting story in and of itself, but it's particularly interesting given the involvement of the Trump administration in it.
Yeah, it sounds really weird. Is there any? Can you think of any reason why Trump would want MBS over Bin Nayef?
So I think that it had to do with the fact that the Trump folks, Jared Kushner particularly, identified Mohammed bin Salman as somebody who would take risks, someone who would try to change many of the elements of the domestic politics of the kingdom, de-emphasize the religious element, cooperate with Kushner on Arab-Israeli peace issues, take a very strong stand toward Iran. These are the things that the Trump administration wanted coming in. Mohammed bin Nayef was more cautious, if you will, a more traditional Saudi leader. He wanted to cooperate with the United States, but I don't know how far he would have gone in terms of domestic political changes in Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure how far he would have gone signing on to a Trump administration Arab-Israeli peace plan. So I think that there was this idea in the Trump White House that this guy, Mohammed bin Salman, was on the same wavelength as they were, and that he would move faster than Mohammed bin Nayef.
See, I was under the impression that MBS rose to power because of his economic vision. To be more specific, he recognized some of the economic problems that were going on in Saudi Arabia, and that's how he ascended to power. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but that was like my initial understanding of how he rose to power, is because he had this vision, Saudi 2030, Vision 2030, I believe. Can you speak to a little bit more about the economic state of Saudi Arabia right now and what they plan on doing in the future?
Sure. So I think that the Vision 2030 thing was not the cause of his rise to power. It was one of the consequences of the rise to power. One of the things that I think made him attractive to the Trump administration and to many people in Saudi Arabia was that he recognized that Saudi Arabia couldn't rely on oil forever. The Saudi economy is extremely oil dependent. Oil accounts for well over 85% of government revenue. And it's depending on how you calculate it, it's a large chunk of the GDP. There's no question about that. When Mohammed bin Salman came in, when his father came into power, when King Salman came in 2015, oil prices were very low, right? They were down below $40 a barrel. They were in the 30s. And at that level, you just couldn't fund the Saudi government. And so I think that there was quite a bit of leeway for Mohammed bin Salman to say, look, we can't go on like this. We have to change our economy. And Vision 2030 was rolled out in 2016. Very ambitious targets about how the Saudi economy would change through foreign investment, through greater domestic private sector investment, less reliance on the government to provide citizens with jobs, more jobs in the private sector. But it's a lot easier to say those things than to do them. The whole Saudi private sector was built on a model of relatively cheap foreign labor. Probably 90% of the private sector workforce in Saudi Arabia is foreign labor. That's both high-end workers, engineers, consultants, people who make the place run, middle-level workers, your electricians, your plumbers. They might be from Egypt, they might be from Yemen, they might be from India, accountants, and then your low-level workers, the guys who clean the streets. They're from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, places like that. This was a model that was very successful in the Saudi private sector. The Saudi private sector was going gangbusters over the last 15 years. They probably added 1 million jobs to the economy, but 90% of those jobs went to foreign workers. Mohammed bin Salman said, we have to do something different there. But then, 2016, 2017, oil prices started going up. And as oil prices start going up, there's just much less sense of emergency about the economy. And Mohammed bin Salman has been drawing back some of the austerity measures, like cutting government spending that were part of Vision 2030. And I think that what these last few years have shown is how difficult it is to change an economy so dependent on oil and a private sector so dependent on cheaper foreign labor into the Vision 2030 model.
So that actually leads me to my next question. I want to know more about the purge. I guess MBS, how he consolidated power to himself. We all know about the purge, and I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2017, he purged about 300 members of the elite into a really nice jail called the Ritz-Carlton. I was really curious what your opinion would be on this. Do you think it was MBS trying to take down his political rivals, or do you think it was more so him shaking down the political elite for cash for not going along with his economic reforms?
I think it was more the latter.
Okay.
I think that he had basically consolidated his power. He had moved Mohammed bin Nayef out of the crown prince position. And the members of the ruling family who were in the Ritz-Carlton, I didn't see them particularly as threats to his power. Now, it doesn't have to be all one thing and all the other. He did cut at some of the sons of King Abdullah, cut at their wealth, cut at their positions within the government. And you could see that as part of a clearing of potential political rivals. But I think that the main thrust of the Ritz-Carlton roundup and the 300 people who were in there was not a consolidation of power in his hands within the ruling family. He had already done that. I think it was a message to the economic elites of the kingdom. And the vast majority of the people who were in there were not members of the ruling family. They were the economic elites, not the ruling family elites. Some were in there, but we're talking about 10, 12, 15 of 300 or so. Most of the people who were in there were the economic elites. And I think that he was trying to send a couple of messages. One, I think it was a shakedown. He was looking for money to fund his grand vision of Vision 2030, of a changed Saudi economy, which the Saudi private sector really wasn't making major investments in at that time. I think it was also an effort to some extent to clear out some of the leading business families in Saudi Arabia, grab some of their assets, and maybe open up space for him to create his own, if you will, client private sector. We'll see how that develops. I think a lot of this backfired on him, though. I think that it led to an even greater reluctance on the part of foreign investors to invest in Saudi Arabia. Right? If you see the government basically taking the assets without due process of leading figures, some of the major names in the Saudi economy, you have to wonder about the security of your own investment in that context. I think it also just redoubled the reluctance of many in the Saudi private sector to invest under the current circumstances. Up until 2017, the rules of the game in Saudi Arabia were pretty clear in the economy. They are absolutely unclear now. We don't know what's coming after them. And capital is a coward. Capital isn't going to invest if they don't know the rules.
Yeah, something that I saw that was interesting. Netflix had to take a show down, and I believe in Saudi Arabia. It was the comedian who is on the Trevor Noah show.
Right, Hassan Minhaj.
Yes, he was critical of the Saudi government or something like that. I honestly don't know the full story of what he said that was offensive, but he was forced to they were forced to take the show down from Netflix. And I can see how Google and Facebook and all these tech giants would say, well, this guy is behaving erratically right now. We really can't predict his behavior. We're not going to invest it. So I can definitely see how situations like that could lead to could really, I guess, dismantle the hopes of them creating a knowledge-based economy.
Yeah, I mean, the Hassan Minhaj show, which is called Patriot Act, it's a Netflix streaming show. It's basically kind of a riff on the news with some comedy. Uh, you can see, I mean, you can see the episode. It's still up. It's just not streaming in Saudi now. But if there's one thing that will make something a hit in any country, it's to ban it in that country. So my guess is that Saudis will be watching it even more than they might have been previously.
Yeah, and from my understanding, Saudi Arabia per capita, they have the highest Twitter use.
Yeah,
So Saudis.
And one of the highest internet penetration rates in the Middle East.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so if you think the Arab Spring was created by Twitter and the internet, Saudi Arabia is the outstanding counterexample, because there's no country in the Middle East that's more internet penetrated than Saudi Arabia, and yet it was the Arab state, the large Arab state that had the least disruption in the Arab Spring.
And speaking of Arab Spring, I know this is a little off topic, but I figured I'd ask you anyway. So what was Saudi Arabia's, or let me peel this back a little bit. So I've heard the term a term called ruling bargain when it comes to the relationship between the Saudi royal family and the population. And the term refers to the royal family will take care of all the material needs of the Saudi citizens, meaning they'll subsidize their housing, water, medicine, I think electricity at one time. They'll subsidize their way of living. However, if they fail to provide those types of subsidies, I mean, do you anticipate some type of backlash from the community?
Well, we've already seen a backlash. Some of the things that Mohammed Bin Salman did in Vision 2030 was cut the subsidies for electricity and water use, and thus raising people's bills. And there was a lot of complaining, a lot of it on Twitter. And as oil prices went back up in 2017, they rolled back some of the austerity measures. Now, I think that the charging closer to world prices, to real world prices for electricity and water is actually essential for Saudi Arabia. I mean, the level of waste in electricity use and water use, I think, is very, very high. And the only way you can get that rationalized is through the price mechanism. So you subsidize people, of course they're going to use a lot more of the commodity. But there was a backlash to that. Now, did that lead people into the streets? No. Didn't lead people into the streets. I actually think that the Saudi regime is pretty stable. They have lots of money in the bank. There's still about $500 billion in hard currency reserves that the state has. The potential opponents of the regime domestically are themselves divided between kind of more hardline Wahhabi types, people who are more sympathetic to the Al-Qaeda view of the world, the Islamic State view of the world, versus people who would like perhaps a more open system. And all sorts of groups in between. You've got a Shia minority in Saudi Arabia that would have a very hard time making common cause with these more radical Sunni types, even though they both don't like the regime. So I think that as long as the Saudi ruling family can keep the unity together and oil prices don't completely collapse, the regime's prospects are pretty good. But without a doubt, there was grumbling when the government cut back on these subsidies.
Do you know if there's any backlash from when MBS allowed women to drive in Saudi Arabia? Was there any type of backlash?
I haven't seen any public backlash. There were some Twitter complaints, but I haven't seen anything that was, certainly no public demonstrations. I didn't think there'd be any. I think the wives and daughters of the clerics will be among the first behind the wheel.
So I guess his reform on women being able to drive, in my opinion, it's the best thing that he's done so far as the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Now, I want to turn the conversation into some of the more negative things that he's done, and I'm not even really going to include the unfortunate murder of Jamal Khashoggi. What is the current status of the war in Yemen?
So the war in Yemen is a humanitarian disaster and a political stalemate. Uh, when the Saudis went in and the Emiratis went in on the ground, the Saudis went in the air mostly. The Houthi movement, which is loosely allied with Iran, more closely allied with Iran now than it might have been 5 or 6 years ago. They were on the verge of capturing Aden. They had captured Sana'a, the capital. They were on the verge of capturing Aden and basically taking control of most of the population centers of the country. That led the Saudis and the Emiratis, who worried that this would be an Iranian gain in the geopolitical game, led them to intervene. And at the beginning, the intervention was successful. It pushed the Houthis back towards Sana'a. But then the military momentum stalled. And for the last couple of years, it's basically been pretty static, and but continued bombing campaigns by the Saudis, continued deprivation of the Yemeni people, cholera outbreaks, food shortages. The Saudis and the Emiratis have some responsibility for this. The Houthis have some responsibility for this. It's not all one-sided, but what the Saudis have not been able to do is bring this war to a close, either through a victory or through a negotiated settlement. And that, I think, is the enormous political failure of the Saudis. And now they've got to decide. They got to find some way to bring this war to a close, because I think that they're losing more and more support internationally, even in the Trump administration, for the war. And it's extremely costly. And thus, it does seem to me that we would have to say that this is a failure on the Saudi part. Now, it's a failure that they can probably sustain because they're not losing a lot of people, right? There's not a lot of casualties on the Saudi side for this war. But it's going to have to be international pressure, which the Khashoggi situation opens up that window of more pressure on the Saudis, which might push toward some kind of diplomatic solution on Yemen. Certainly the UN mediator, Ambassador Griffiths, has been more active in the last couple of months. And there have been meetings up in Sweden between the Houthis and representatives of the Saudi-supported Yemeni government. So we'll see where that moves.
So how much does the war, or how much does the responsibility of the war fall on Mohammed bin Salman's shoulders?
Oh, it's his war.
Okay.
He was defense minister when this war started, and at the beginning, Saudi media very much depicted it as his war, because I think they thought they were going to get a pretty quick victory. It's not depicted as the Crown Prince's war as often now, but it certainly was his. It was his initiative.
Do you have any idea, like, what made him want to go? Like, what did he overestimate Saudi Arabia? It seems like he thinks that Saudi Arabia is a great power.
Yeah,
like they have the.
Yeah, I think he overestimates Saudi power. I think that his uncles who ruled before him had a pretty good appreciation for the limits of Saudi power. Operating in a region where they had to deal with big regional states like Egypt under Nasser, or Iran, where they had to deal with the Cold War. They understood, I think, the limits of Saudi power. Mohammed bin Salman is a young man. He didn't grow up during those periods where the Saudi state was facing really serious pressures in the 50s and 60s from Arab nationalism, in the 70s. Late 70s and into the 80s from the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War. Even the Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 would have been something that he would have experienced not as an adult, but as a child, because he's only in his early 30s. So I think that he has an exaggerated view of Saudi power, and perhaps he's learning lessons in the last couple of months from the fallout of the Khashoggi affair about the limits of Saudi power. I mean, I think he looked around and saw Russia goes and kills its dissident opponents abroad, and China does that, and the Iranians do that, all of which is true. But I think he overestimated Saudi power. He's not Russia. He's not China. He's not even Iran.
Yeah, and I have a question that I'm hoping that you can help me further understand. So the Houthis are a Shiite group, but I'm having trouble connecting them with Iran. Like, are they an Iranian client?
Right. So we have to get into the weeds a little bit on Shia history here. The main vast majority of the Shia population in the Muslim world is what's called Twelver Shia. It has to do with the line of imams from the Prophet Muhammad and his successors in the Shia view, people of his bloodline. The vast majority see the line of succession stopping at the 12th imam, and we won't get into the theology of it and all. But that's the Shiism in Iran. In Yemen, the Houthis and the Shia population in Yemen are called Zaydis. Their notion of the line of succession from the Prophet Muhammad broke off at the 7th imam, and in fact there was a line of imams that ruled in Yemen, more or less, right up until 1962, right up to the North Yemeni Revolution of 1962. And so theologically and historically, there's not a whole lot of connection between the Zaydis in North Yemen, in the northern part of Yemen, and the Iranians. But the Houthi movement, which emerged in the 1990s, really in opposition to the previous regime in Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the Houthis adopted the rhetoric of the Iranian Revolution. Death to America, death to Israel, all that kind of stuff. I think to get the Iranians to notice them. I think that my soundbite on this is that the Houthis wanted to be Iranian clients more than Iran wanted to be their patron. And there was some connection between the two, but it was not nearly as extensive as, say, Iran's relationship with Hezbollah in Lebanon, or Iran's relationship with the Iraqi Shia militias that it helped set up after the American invasion, and even before. But when the Saudis and the Emiratis went in to Yemen, the Iranians saw a low-cost way to really bleed the Saudis. And so they have been undoubtedly supportive politically, to some extent economically, to some extent in terms of arms shipments and arms deliveries to the Houthis. So yeah, I mean, I think that the Houthis are allies of Iran. Are they clients of Iran? Not to the extent that Hezbollah is, or some of the Iraqi militias are.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess my perception was that the Houthis, they want to be Hezbollah, but Iran doesn't really feel the same way. But they might as well just throw them a bone if they're going to cause a bit of chaos in Saudi Arabia. That was always my perception. Like they'll just throw them a bone. Maybe, I don't know, like how much they're funding them, or if they're funding them at all. But in reality, they don't care too much about them, rather than their ability to cause a headache.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We know that there's some Hezbollahis from Lebanon down with the Houthis, training them, working with them, which makes sense because, I mean, they speak Arabic, so I mean, they're better on the ground allies than the Iranians would be. But no, there's a relationship between the Iranians and the Houthis, but it's not as tight as some of the other relationships Iran has with its clients and allies throughout the region.
So this brings me to the big question I have, and the question is, what do you think the future holds for Mohammed bin Salman? Will he eventually be ousted?
No, I don't think so. I mean, okay. I think he's going to be king of Saudi Arabia. The fact that the family that groups in the family who don't like him have not been able to use this crisis, the Khashoggi crisis, to mobilize a counterforce within the family against him, at least so far, where there's been no public indication of that. The next big crisis that Mohammed bin Salman is going to have is when his father dies. The king gives him cover. When his father dies, that will be, I think, the last chance people in the family will have to mount a challenge to him. And the question is, will they be organized enough? Will they be brave enough? Will they have enough support within Saudi family and Saudi society to do it? If I had to guess right now, I would guess no, that they won't be able to do it. Again, things could change over time. But if I had to put a bet right now, I would bet that Mohammed bin Salman will be the next king.
Yeah, I was on the fence about that. I kind of thought that he was going to be ousted during the heat of the Khashoggi stuff. However, people have short memories, and I mean, less and less people talk about it nowadays. People are more concentrated on the war in Yemen and what's going on in Syria right now. But I think that I kind of think that he's going to be around as well. I have a quick question before we wrap things up, and I meant to ask it earlier. Do you think that King Salman appointed Mohammed bin Salman as a crown prince because he just wanted his son to be the new heir?
Well, the king has a lot of sons, a number of sons, some older, a number older than Mohammed bin Salman, more experienced in government positions. The persistent story you hear in Saudi Arabia is that the king chose Mohammed bin Salman because he saw something in him that reminded him of his father, Ibn Saud. Kind of a toughness, a directness. That's at least the story that goes around. So I think that to some extent it was King Salman saying, well, if we have to pass rulership to the next generation, I want somebody tough enough to do it, to be able to handle the job. And a father, I think, probably maybe with a little bit of bias, looks at one of his sons to do that.
Yeah, I mean, when he was first emerging from the scene, he certainly seemed charismatic. I'll give him that. When he was hanging out with Mark Zuckerberg playing virtual reality games, I was like, wow, this is a handsome guy who says he wants to bring social reform to Saudi Arabia. This might be good. And then one bad thing after another happens, but you know, who knows? Greg, I know you have some. I know you have some books. Love to plug them in.
So yeah, I wish I could say I had something more recent on Saudi Arabia, but the most recent book is from Cambridge University Press. It's called The International Politics of the Persian Gulf. Came out in 2010. It's not exactly a page turner in terms of being a read like a good novel, but I think it's a pretty comprehensive review of the wars that we've seen in the Persian Gulf region, the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the American response to that, and then the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 and what came after that. So if you're interested in getting up to date on that background, I can recommend that book.
And then I've seen another one, Oil Monarchies, Domestic and Security Challenges in the Arab Gulf States.
Right. I wrote that back in the 90s. So it was published in 1994. I think it holds up as background, but it's not going to give you any of the more recent stuff.
Awesome. Well, one of the books that got me interested into the Middle East was actually a book called Oil Kings about the Shah.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know that book was written. Yeah, I know that was written. I can't tell you when it was written.
Early 2010s. I think it came out 2011, 2012.
Okay, it's fairly new.
It was about the 70s. It was based on it was actually based on the American diplomatic archives, which had been released after the 30 Years Rule. And so it was based on kind of State Department and White House archives. The story of the oil revolution of the early 70s and how the Shah of Iran and the Saudis played into it in American politics, and how the Nixon White House was divided. Some of them liked the Saudis, some of them liked the Shah. was a good story. It was and a good read. And he's a good writer.
Yeah, it was a really good story. And another book that I'm currently reading right now, and I recently found this out, and I'm a huge basketball fan, and I don't know how I didn't know this, but Steve Kerr's dad was a academic who focused on the Middle East. Like he lived in Lebanon, correct? And
Yeah,
he
Malcolm Kerr.
Malcolm Kerr, and he wrote a book called The Arab Cold War.
Yeah, I still assign the Arab Cold War in my classes.
Okay.
It's a classic, short, readable account of the rivalry between Gamal Abdel Nasser and his rivals within the Arab nationalist movement and opponents like the Saudis of the Arab nationalist movement. It's I think still an essential read. Yeah, he was a professor at UCLA. Wrote a number of books on the Middle East. Then he spent time in Lebanon. I mean, Steve Kerr grew up part of his life in Lebanon. And Malcolm Kerr went back to Lebanon as the president of the American University of Beirut and was assassinated in 1983, as I recall, maybe 84, probably by allies of Iran within Lebanon, kind of the precursors of Hezbollah, because the American University of Beirut was and is kind of the leading institutional expression of American influence and Western influence in Lebanon. And so, yeah, it's for people like me who study the Middle East, particularly political scientists. Malcolm was a political scientist. I'm a political scientist. He's kind of our patron saint. And so, yeah, it's somebody whose work I think is still very valuable to read.
Yeah, I'm reading it right now, and I really can't put it down. It's a great book, and I was really surprised to find out that Steve Kerr's dad was the Malcolm Kerr.
Yep.
I even heard that his when Steve Kerr was in college, fans would yell PLO out loud.
Yeah,
that's a funny story.
He played for University of Arizona, and especially at Arizona State games when he was on the foul line, that chant PLO, and trying to rattle him. And he's even as a college student, he's such a self-possessed guy that he told the press afterwards, I don't know whether they're chanting PLO. The PLO guys guarded our street in Beirut. I knew them. They were our friends.
That's hilarious.
It wasn't the PLO who went after his father.
That's hilarious. It shows you how mean college fans are.
That's for sure.
Yeah, especially if you go to. Well, I'm sure you're used to it if you're over at Texas A&M.
Yeah, we're serious about our sports.
If SEC is a different level.
Yeah.
Most New Yorkers do not understand the intensity of college sports until they go down south, of football especially.
Particularly at football. Yeah.
Well, any closing statements? Love to give the closing floor to you.
Sure. I mean, I think our relationship, the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, continues to be a very important one. It's always been a troubled one. It's never been one based on values. If you see any reason for the U.S. to continue its relationship with Saudi Arabia, it has to do with your thoughts about American interests and stability in the region and oil. And that's the kind of debate I think we need to have. I mean, this was never a nice regime. It was never a regime that respected human rights. And the question is the cost of associating the United States with a regime like that greater than the value it gets for its very specific material interests in the region. And that's really where the debate is. I tend to come down on the side that says, yeah, I mean, with all the problems, we still need a decent relationship with Saudi Arabia. But I think it requires us to set some guardrails for Mohammed bin Salman about what we can and can't tolerate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we'll close out with that. Gregory, it was an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Really, really appreciate your time. I'm going to continue, watching for your work. I love the lectures that are the lectures that you give at different think tanks are awesome, especially the ones at the DU Center and the Center for Middle East, I believe as well. There's so many think tanks, but I specifically search your name in YouTube and I'm looking for lectures on the Middle East. So I really appreciate you putting those out there. And everyone, I will be posting the description of Gregory's books. So check those out. They'll be on, I guess they'll be on Amazon. And Thanks again, Gregory. Really appreciate the time.
My pleasure. It was fun.